Connie and all you nice folks that came today. So without further ado, this is my presentation of the Underground Railroad through Iowa. And not an expert in it by any means, but it is just a nice presentation that it did happen before and during the Civil War. So enjoy your lunch as you watch this next scene.
Oh, we'll rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah, down with the traitor. Shouting the battle cry of freedom. We are springing to the call of our brothers gone before, shouting the battle cry of freedom, and we'll fill the vacant ranks with 1,000,000 free men more, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah, down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will welcome to our numbers the loyal, true, and brave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And although they may be poor, not a man shall be a slave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah, down with the traitor, star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. So we're springing to the call from the east and from the west, shouting the battle cry of freedom, and we'll hurl the rebel crew from the land we love the best, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah, down with the traitor, star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. While we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
Yeah, I thought that was very fitting. So what I learned when I was doing this story was the fact that long before the Civil War started, there was a book that we have a copy here in the museum called Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she was an abolitionist as well as her entire family, and she wrote this book. And it was the highest selling book at the time in 1851, only to one other book, and that was the Holy Bible. People liked to read, and they read her story. Well, as people read it, they became entwined with the battle of slavery, because she wanted the slaves to be free already in 1851. And so it says at the bottom here that she went to visit Abraham Lincoln, and he declared, saying to her, "So you are the little lady who started this great war." And she was very much a part of the beginning of the Underground Railroad through Pennsylvania and Ohio. And what I'd like to note here is the fact that I'm going to cover these people who were so important at the start of the Civil War. They were all women. They were very much opposed to slavery with their Christian values. They were mainly daughters of ministers. And so the next one we have is Harriet Tubman, that you may remember. And she took 300 slaves under her wing and led them to freedom in Canada. And herself being a slave was quite an accomplishment in that day. For when she was a slave, she was actually whipped as a child and injured in her head, and her brain, when she would go to bed at night, she would have visions of God, and her purpose on this earth were to free her people. And so she too wondered about Abraham Lincoln. And she went on to say, "God won't let Master Lincoln beat the South till he does the right thing. Master Lincoln, he's a great man, and I'm a poor Negro. But the Negro can tell Master Lincoln how to save the money and the young men. He can do it by setting the Negro free." So the Underground Railroad started in the east, ended up coming to the west as far as Iowa and Nebraska. And that's a real fuzzy map, but until the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in '63 by Abraham Lincoln, the slaves were not allowed to be free. You can see all the different places that the Underground Railroad existed. All the red arrows, Missouri to Iowa. And so it was very interesting that it's more than I could begin to take up the topic here today. So my focus is going to be on Iowa. This is the southern half of Iowa, and you can see the beginnings of the Underground Railroad started in Missouri on the southwest corner.
There you go.
There you go. Started down here, and it came up through Tabor, all these small towns on this route. And Grinnell came this way, over to DeWitt and Clinton. And yet, this map, when it was printed, didn't have enough, all of the history, because the Underground Railroad, being the secret that it was, there were no history books at that time to tell exactly where it went. So the connection here to Jackson County was the fact that Jackson County was just between Clinton and Dubuque. I no doubt think there probably were underground slaves that came through Jackson County, but we cannot prove it. But just a few hours ago, Don gave me a paper that was printed this past January of 2025. It has the story of Dubuque County's participation in the Underground Railroad. If I can find it here. So if anyone wants to see this paper at the end, it will be here for a short time. And one of the pictures in here is a man named William Tick. He was the first mayor of Dyersville, but he was also the conductor on the Underground Railroad in Clinton County. So that was something I did not know.
Hey Ray, what day was that paper?
Telegraph Herald.
What day?
Date. The date of the paper was printed January 26, 2025. So we had people involved to make the Underground Railroad happen. The people who helped the slaves find the railroad were called the agents. And we had the guides who were the conductors. The places they hid were stations or way stations. Station masters hid the slaves in their own homes. People escaping slavery were the passengers or the cargo. And the slaves would obtain a ticket. And they said the wheels would keep on turning. Well, there wasn't any railroad. It was the fact that the slaves would keep on moving from place to stay away from their captors who wanted to take them back to Missouri and further south. The stockholders were the people in charge of making the railroad happen. And of course, the Promised Land was the code word for Canada. The River Jordan was the Ohio River to get down to the Mississippi to go its way to Canada. And heaven, that was their home in Canada. The Big Dipper was known as the drinking gourd. The railroad was often known as the Freedom Train, Gospel Train, which headed to heaven or the Promised Land in Canada. Also want to bring up the mention that Mexico was already a free country in the early 1800s. They had abolished slavery, and Canada had also abolished slavery in 1840. We were the country of North America that wanted to abolish slavery and keep it. And it was inevitable that it go away. There was a project in Iowa called the Iowa Freedom Trail Project. And yet to this day, new information about the Underground Railroad. There were 900 names in its database, and today there are 1,500 different sources of information about the Iowa participation in the Underground Railroad. Here you can see an easier map again. You can see there was a path to Dubuque. Again, along that same. To get absolute verification of the railroad activity is difficult just simply because the activities were felonies under the federal law. The first act was 1793, and the second one, which is notorious for the Civil War, was done in 1850, called the Fugitive Slave Act. So in today's program, I'm going to highlight the 5 remaining homes or dwellings or barns that are here in Iowa yet in existence that have now been turned into museums throughout the state. Tabor was down in southwest Iowa and is known for the house that was owned by Reverend John Todd. And most of the homes and stops on the Underground Railroad were created by the I'll think of it. By the Christian faith. And there's a picture of today, the house in Tabor, Iowa. Congregational ministers started the Underground Railroad throughout Iowa. Here is the next stop that I have is the George Hitchcock House, and it's in a town called Lewis, Iowa. And further on in my presentation, you'll hear the name of a river. That river is called the Nishnabotna River. And that was a very important river in western Iowa. So here's the location of that on the map. And these pictures here were provided by Dennis and Alice Manns, as they have been there to visit this, so I appreciate their pictures. This is the basement of the Hitchcock house to show where they kept the slaves, to keep them warm, to keep them fed. Alice and Dennis's picture again, as well as that one. And this is the first slide I have where the chief conductor there in Lewis, one of the main players of the Underground Railroad that came through Iowa is the man named John Brown. And so we will focus on John Brown, hopefully at another Brown Bag lunch here in the future. This is the home of, I gotta go back. That's the home of Governor Kirkwood in Des Moines. Again, we'll watch
in West Des Moines, which once served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. It was built by James Jordan, who was a Virginia native and one-time slave catcher. Jordan was so appalled by the experience, he became a fierce abolitionist. In Iowa, he became known as the chief conductor for Polk County. Today, this house is open for tours, reminding people of our country's history and dispelling some myths as well.
That is one of the things that we often talk about on our tours here of the Jordan House, what the Underground Railroad was and wasn't. It was not a series of trains that ran underground like a subway. It was this loose connection of different groups and individuals who helped formerly enslaved people reach freedom.
There weren't many records kept at the Jordan House of its time on the Underground Railroad because helping former slaves escape was dangerous, and it was a federal offense at that time. However, there are coded letters from Jordan to other abolitionists like Josiah Grinnell. He founded Grinnell, Iowa, which was known for being a community of abolitionists and another station on the Underground Railroad. The Jordan House is open for guided tours on Fridays and Saturdays. Some pretty incredible history there, and it's one of those places, if you haven't been, it's great to just go and be in that space.
Our next stop on the route will be in Grinnell, Iowa, which they were talking about. He was the founder of the town. He was a absolutionist. And you can see that he had not only they founded the name of Grinnell, the city, but they also founded Grinnell College. And in your next program dealing with Dr. Luce gave money to that college right here from Maquoketa. See what I'm missing. He was, as you see in the bottom of the screen, elected to the Iowa Senate, and he was a delegate to the 1860 Republican National Convention that nominated Abraham Lincoln. So they were very much known to each other as they were good friends. I'm going to read this for those that may not. This is the final resting place of Josiah Bushnell Grinnell, Congregational minister, co-founder of the town that bears his name, member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and a passionate abolitionist. As an active participant in the Underground Railroad, he used his influence as well as his home to barn to aid slaves in their quest for freedom. He welcomed John Brown and his party to Grinnell as Brown crossed Iowa on his flight from Kansas in 1859. No man in America more fully embodies the whole juice and spirit of rampant abolitionists in its present sense than does J.B. Grinnell in 1862. That is Grinnell's home in Grinnell, Iowa. Another person on the railroad that was important was our own Governor Kirkwood. And he helped the slaves throughout Iowa. And when John Brown raided the Harper's Ferry in Virginia, there was one man from Springdale, which we'll come to, from Springdale, Iowa, and Virginia wanted him back to be prosecuted and hung. Kirkwood would not send him back to Virginia. Our own. And he too, through his support for Lincoln, to read the Emancipation Proclamation. Springdale, little town southwest of here, about 60 miles, is in Cedar County, and that's where John Brown trained his troops to make the raid on Harper's Ferry. And there'll be more about John Brown in a future presentation. This is a picture of John Brown. As you can read that, American abolitionist in decades preceding the Civil War. His own son was killed in Kansas in hopes to end slavery in Kansas, and he became enraged with his son's death, so he planned this raid on Harper's Ferry. He was a devout Christian, but yet he was also a man that he believed all men are created equal, and believed in the operation of the Golden Rule. While he was in Springdale, he also stayed at the William Maxon House and trained more of his followers. Another picture of that home. Here we're going to come to the Llewellyn Quaker Museum. I just thought this was kind of neat, that hush puppies were used to keep freedom seekers safe. When the Quaker abolitionists would head to a church each Sunday, they would toss fritters into the yards that were laced with poison. If a slave catcher came through while they were worshiping, the dogs would eat the poisoned treats, which would hopefully keep them from sniffing out the freedom seekers hiding in the local homes. So there are all kinds of things that took place to get these Negro slaves to safety. This is a picture of the Llewellyn home in Salem, Iowa, which is down on the other end of Iowa, southeast corner. Another picture of the home yet today. The Llewellyn house was owned by Henderson Llewellyn. Couldn't find a picture of him because he moved away from Iowa, went to California. I'm just throwing this in as a side note that he became the Johnny Appleseed of the West. Planted more apple trees and fruit trees in California than any other man, and just to think he came from Iowa. Franklin Pierce home is on Dowd Street in Keosauqua, Iowa. And this one was actually a Methodist, not a Congregationalist, that helped get these slaves to safety. And in this home you can actually see the trap door in the floor, which allowed the slaves to be hidden from anybody to find them. You can see the dwellings, what they look like back in the days years ago, and what a more of a shanty than a home, just to hide these people. And then this one is the underground room was discovered in a shed in DeWitt after a building was torn down. And it was assumed it was used for hiding slaves because it had no other use, and it was close to the proximity of the Wapsie River down by Fairyland. On a side note, this also happens to be within a half mile of where Ruth Wilson lives today. Now I hope you enjoy this next video. This was created in 1956. Turn that up.
I'm on my way to Canada, that cold and dreary land. The dire effect of slavery I can no longer stand. My soul is vexed within me so to think I am a slave. I'm now resolved to strike the blow for freedom or the grave. Oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me. I'm going north to Canada. I'm going to be free. Scared all the chickens out of the feedlot. Hello, boys and girls. How'd you like that song? The chickens here didn't care for it very much. Dr. Pendergraft has to stay because he's on the program. But a long time ago, over 100 years ago, this song was probably sung in the cellar of this house. This is a station on the Underground Railroad, one of the oldest buildings used for that purpose in the state of Iowa. It was a parsonage at one time, but its historical interest rests upon the fact that it was a station on the Underground Railroad. And here at one time, the slaves sang this song about escaping to Canada. And this was also the place where John Brown, Osawatomie Brown of Bloody, Kansas, hid from the officers of the law. I'm sure you've seen pictures of this kind of John Brown, fiery type of rebel, looked very much like the Old Testament prophets. He believed in freedom for the slaves, and he was personally responsible for taking a lot of slaves across Iowa to freedom. At one time, he hid in the basement of this house, in the cellar, in a secret room down there, so the sheriff and other officers of the law couldn't find him. This is near Lewis, Iowa. Let me show you on the map of Iowa where Lewis is located. Lewis is over here, not far from the East Nishnabotna River. This is the Nishnabotna. Some of the people in this part of the state call this the Nishnabotna. but the spelling is Nishnabotna. 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 This is the west Nishnabotna. Right here, this white dot is Lewis. And about a mile west of town is this old slave house, this station on the Underground Railroad. And I'd like to ask Dr. Pendergraft to tell you about that. I'm very glad to have Dr. Pendergraft with me today, not only because he's a good friend of mine, but also because he's my boss. Dr. Pendergraft is Director of Field Services at the Iowa State Teachers College, and radio and TV are a part of field services. So I have to be extra careful today that I say the right thing, because he is not only my boss, he is also an authority on American history, and the history of the West in particular. And he can tell you this story of the Underground Railroad much better than I can. So, Dr. Pendergraft, would you tell the boys and girls about the Underground Railroad?
I'll be glad to, Herb. Of course, the Underground Railroad, what it really means is that the slaves followed this method, a secret route to escape from slavery to freedom. It has nothing to do, of course, with a road or a railroad running underground. As long as we have any recorded history, one man has tried to enslave another man. And as long as that's happened, we've had many, many slaves seeking freedom. Sometimes it's because they were being cruelly treated, overworked, but basically because they wanted to be free. And as long as that's taken place, we've also had the other people who tried to aid these people, these slaves, to escape to freedom. We've always had a group of people who did not feel that the law, which said that a slave should be returned to slavery, was a good law, that there was a higher law, God's law, that said a man had a right to be free, and therefore he was willing to break this first law. Now the title of Underground Railroad actually came from a place in Ohio, Findlay, Ohio, where a group of slaves were being pursued by their master across the Ohio River. And as soon as they landed in Ohio, they seemed to just disappear into the ground. And this old slave owner said, it appears that they have taken an underground road. At this particular time, of course, the railroads were astonishing everyone with their speed, and so it wasn't any time at all until it was said that Underground Railroad was the method by which the slaves escaped to freedom. Now these slaves followed various routes across Iowa. Of course, Iowa became a state here in the 1840s, 1846, and so the first routes were in the settled part of Iowa through here. Farmington, Salem, and there's Denmark down through here, all of which were very famous places, stations, as you call them, on the Underground Railroad through eastern Iowa. Mount Pleasant, Crawfordsville, Columbus Junction, Muscatine, and so on. Then there are other routes which aren't shown on the map here at all. Towns aren't even mentioned. Bloomfield and Centerville, coming up through here from Missouri. You see, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of routes for slaves to escape, clear from the Atlantic Ocean, clear all over into Nebraska. They weren't merely trying to get into the northern states. They were trying to get through the northern states into Canada, which was a free country. Because as long as they were in any part of the United States, they might be returned back into slavery again. In fact, the federal marshals and the court authorities, the sheriffs and so on, were required to help capture the slaves and return them to their masters. Now the most famous of all these underground roads through Iowa was one that you referred to, with a station here at Lewis. And this is sometimes called the John Brown route across Iowa. You'll note that it came across the Missouri River here at Percival, and then on up to Tabor, which is also a very famous underground station. Then across here to Macedonia, to Lewis, to Anita, Stewart, Des Moines, Newton, Grinnell, Marengo, Iowa City, and on across to Clinton, or to Davenport, and Muscatine, and so on. Now you must remember that this is not a road, a well-beaten path, because even though it's shown like this on the map, there are literally dozens of ways that when one particular station became rather too obviously a station on the underground, and the local sheriff had his eye on the place, they would take off some other way. Instead of going from Lewis to Anita, for example, they might strike down Lewis and go across this way and hit the underground later on. They're all heading towards the eastern part of Iowa to Chicago and the Great Lakes, where they would take a ship into Canada. This is a very significant part of our history. The southern slave owners resented very much the whole Underground Railroad method of helping the slaves escape. You see, we had a federal law at this time, the Fugitive Slave Law, which said that masters had a right to capture their escaped slaves, and that when this happened, the sheriff and all the law officers were supposed to help. And there was quite a heavy fine and imprisonment for people that helped the slaves. Now you have the northern people then, many, many hundreds of them, helping these slaves. So they were guilty of breaking the federal law. And the Southerners resented this very keenly. They said the whole Constitution and the whole body of federal laws is a compact, a contract between all the people of the whole country. And when one party to the contract is deliberately breaking the contract, as they were doing with the Fugitive Slave Law, then the other party to the contract has a perfect right to pull up stakes, to pull out of the Constitution, pull away from the rest of the states, so they can keep their slaves unprotected. So the Underground Railroad, you see, has a very great significance. It's one of the main reasons why the South was so bitter towards the North, and why they were interested in seceding from the Union, and which, of course, brought on the Civil War.
Dr. Pendergraft, we refer to these places as stations on the Underground Railroad. I've also seen reference to conductors on the Underground Railroad. I suppose those were the people who helped the slaves to escape.
Yes, they developed a whole vocabulary of names, taking their names from the railroad, which was so popular in those days. The conductors, of course, were the individuals who took them from one station to another.
Yes.
And you also had the engineers and other people that they gave them the titles for. The station master, of course, would be the person who secrets them while at a particular station.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Pendergraft. I'd like to show you, boys and girls, some books that are interesting in connection with the story of the Underground Railroad. Here is one about Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was a Negro slave who helped 300 of the people of her race to escape from slavery. This is a very interesting story, and it's based upon historical fact. The story of Harriet Tubman. The book written by Anne Patry. And here is another one, Escape by Night. Now you notice the cover picture there. Night was the best time to transfer these slaves from one station to another, because the law enforcement officers were not likely to be quite so vigilant at that time. And if the night was stormy, that made it all the more successful to transport the slaves from one place to another. So here you see a wagon which is carrying these slaves from one station to another. This has some interesting pictures in it. Here's one here that shows one of the conductors taking some of the slaves across country from one station to another. Here is another one that shows how the slaves were sometimes disguised. They were veiled, and there's a sheriff standing by, watching these women just walk right by under his nose, and he doesn't realize that these are escaped slaves. They're dressed like white folks, and the veils over their faces conceal the fact that their skins are black. I'm sure your teacher must have a copy of this Iowan magazine for July 1956. It's the one that has this picture of the beautiful church with the white spire on the cover. This has a very fine article in it about the Underground Railroad in Iowa, and shows many places on the map of Iowa which were not indicated on this map that Dr. Pendergraft showed you a moment ago. A very fine article about the Underground Railroad in this particular issue of the Iowan magazine. So you look that up and read the story about the Underground. Now, last summer, when I was making arrangements for our visit today, I took some movies of the area around this old slave house, And I'd like to have you see this film so that you get some idea of how well it was located for this particular purpose. You see, it was not in town. Very few of these stations on the Underground Railroad were in the heavily settled parts of the state. That is, usually the stations were out on the edge of town somewhere so that the neighbors couldn't see what was going on. And this particular house was located on a hill where people could look around and see people coming, and it was very well located for that purpose. The film is in Ames, and I'd like to have Mr. Bork show it to you now so that we can all look at it together. If you're ready, Mr. Bork, let's look at it. Here we go. Here is a view toward the west, which shows the countryside, the rolling hills, and the many places of concealment that the slaves might use on their way to the house, which is coming into the picture here at the left. There is the house, you see. Now this was on a hill, and there were valleys on both sides of it. Looking east, you see the valley of the East Nishnabotna River, winding along, and Lewis is on the far side of this stream. Even today, this house is remote from other houses in the neighborhood, so there are no other locations suitable for it. Here is the Nishnabotna River. You see, it's just a creek, really, not a big roaring stream like the Mississippi or the Missouri, but it's called a river. A bridge crossing the stream here now. At the time this house was used as a station on the Underground Railroad, there was no bridge. There was just a ferry. And when the water was low, of course, they could go across without taking the boat. But when the water was high, they had to use a ferry, and that sometimes caused some complications in getting the slaves across the stream. Here are some views in the village of Lewis itself, about a mile from the old slave house. Very quiet little town. Business district is about 2 blocks long. And there is the Lewis drugstore where you can buy a copy of a book that I'll show you in a minute that tells the story of the old slave house. We have made a complete trip through the business district here. Some very friendly people living here now, just as there were over 100 years ago when the slaves needed friends. Not much traffic on the street, you see. That dog there isn't a bit disturbed by walking across the street very, very slowly. Well, here's that book that I wanted to show you. The Land and the Men, Now and Then. And inside, there is a story of the old slave house. You see the picture there at the top of the page? There are 2 or 3 pages here about this old slave house. And you can order this book, you get a copy of it for $1 by writing to the Lewis drugstore, Lewis, Iowa. That's a bargain. I'm not giving a commercial for this book, you understand, but I mean this is a book which you can only get in that one place. Now let me show you some pictures of some of the landmarks in this area. First of all, I'd like to show you a picture of the slave house that we're visiting. And I thought perhaps we ought to take a closer look at this in order to show the crack in the wall that has developed here. This is made of stone, this old house, and the walls are very thick, but after all, it is over 100 years old, and a crack has formed in here, and this has all been filled with cement. It's still a good, strong house. But it is interesting because this was a station on the Underground Railroad, probably the most famous station in Iowa. Now, remember, boys and girls, this is a private dwelling now. It is occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Allen Miller. And if you go to Lewis and want to find this old slave house, ask someone to tell you how to get to the Allen Miller place. But when you get out there, don't just walk in. How would you feel if somebody just walked into your house in order to look around? We must respect the privacy of people who live in a house. But Mr. and Mrs. Miller are always very kind and accommodating if you take the trouble to knock and ask whether you might see the basement, which was a shelter for the passengers on the Underground Railroad. And they'll be very glad to have you come in. Here is a view of the basement and the fireplace, and the slaves were able to prepare their meals here. And this was also the first altar for a church in the Lewis area. The house itself was built by Reverend George B. Hitchcock, who was the minister in the Lewis area. And he believed in helping the slaves escape. He didn't support the idea that any man could be owned by another man. He believed, as Dr. Pendergraft said, that there is a higher law, the law of God, which says that all men are equal. So many times services were conducted here in front of this fireplace. And John Brown stood in front of this fireplace many times when he came through this part of the country, talking to the people who were his charges and whom he was conducting to freedom. This is the outside entrance, you see. And there was a secret room in this cellar, which looked just like a part of the wall where the slaves could be hidden in case the sheriff got on their trail. Here is a house near the river. This is the old ferry house. The people who operated the ferry lived here. And this was a favorite place for the sheriff and the law enforcement officers to watch for people who might be coming from the old slave house. There's no record that they ever caught anybody, but at least they kept watching. Here is the first courthouse in the county. It now is a private dwelling. Another interesting landmark in Lewis, near the city park. And in the park itself, there is this Mormon Trail marker. The Mormon Trail also came through this part of the country. And I think that's very interesting, that the route of the Underground Railroad and the earlier Mormon Trail of 1846 came through this same general area. And that's an interesting coincidence. And I'd like to ask you about that, Dr. Pendergraft. Is it true that once a trail like this was established, for example, the Mormon Trail, that John Brown saw that this was the logical trail to use for the Underground Railroad?
Well, actually, of course, they're both going directed east and west. The Mormons are going west.
Yes.
The slaves are going to the east, and they would follow the route which would be most advantageous. And of course, you must remember that when the Mormons went west, they did tend to build houses and cabins, and they tried to find the best fords and streams and so on. So there were good reasons why the slave would follow the same general route at least.
Yes. Well, what was the reason for establishing this trail in the first place? Was it on high ground and therefore easily traveled?
Yeah, they tried to find the easiest route for them to go. Of course, they were also looking for good campsites where there'd be fresh water and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that these old trails are the present highways?
In a general way, yes. They follow the same general path, although the highway doesn't stick very close to the trail itself.
Well, I thought perhaps the advantages of this high ground and the fact that they would not get into low places and muddy areas.
Yes, but with modern machinery, of course, they have been able to take off the hills and fill in the level, the valleys and so on, to a large extent.
Now, as far as the Underground Railroad is concerned, I imagine there would be an advantage in staying off some of the main trails, that is the stagecoach trails. And
very definitely.
And in order to escape detection.
Very definitely. That's why the trail very seldom take the same route any time. It might vary 12, 15 miles.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you say that the activity on the Underground Railroad began about the time this house was built, around the 1850s, as far as Iowa is concerned?
The activity on the Underground in Iowa began in the eastern part of the state, that is going from north to south, in Muscatine and through there, in Salem. Somewhat earlier, of course, it did in the west. This particular route through Lewis was in the latter part of the 1850s, from about 1854 to 55 until about 1860.
That is, as soon as the Civil War began, I suppose there was no special reason to operate the Underground Railroad anymore.
That's right. The slaves were being freed by the advancing armies of the north, of course.
How do you account for the fact that there were so many ministers involved in this operation of the Underground Railroad? I mentioned the fact that Reverend Hitchcock built this house and built it very largely as a refuge for slaves on the Underground Railroad. In Tabor, Reverend John Todd was one of the leaders in the Underground Railroad.
Of course, among the leaders of the whole underground movement, the anti-slavery movement for that matter, throughout the North, the certain creeds, like the Quakers and the Calvinistic groups, the Presbyterians and so on, were very staunch in their belief that slavery was wrong. So it was logical that they would take leading part in helping the slaves escape.
Fine. Thank you very much, Dr. Pendergraft. Now, I think we'll have time for a little review here before our visit is over. Let's go over briefly some of the points we've tried to make in connection with our visit here in Lewis. Remember that this house back here, the house built by the Reverend Mr. George B. Hitchcock, was to all outward purposes a parsonage, the home to the minister in his town. And yet, as I've mentioned several times, he was thinking at the same time of the use of this house as a station on the Underground Railroad. This is not the first house that Reverend Hitchcock used. There was a wooden building near this location, which was his first home, and the slaves soon discovered that here was a friend who would help them on their way. And so many people stopped in this wooden structure that Mr. Hitchcock decided that you have to have a larger house. And the main purpose of the house, really, was to serve as a station. Remember also that, according to the terminology of the Underground Railroad, Reverend Hitchcock was a conductor. So this was the home of a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And as Dr. Pendergraft told you, the name of the Underground Railroad came from a remark made by a southern planter who said, "It seems that the slaves are escaping to Canada as though they were traveling on a railroad under the ground." So perhaps that can serve as the theme for our review cartoon. Let's assume this is the surface of the ground. And here, underground, is a train of the old days. Trains at that time, in the 1850s, had this funnel type of smokestack, as you remember. And here are the wheels and the back wheel. Now, of course, if this is the top of the ground, it would be very difficult for a train actually to go underground. It would take a tremendous system of tunnels, wouldn't it? We know that in the West, many times the railroads tunneled through mountains because it was easier to do that than to go over the top. But an underground railroad, as we use it in American history, did not mean that any part of this escape route was underground, with the exception of tunnels that were sometimes built between stations in the same community. In Salem, for example, there are two houses about 2 blocks apart which were actually connected by a tunnel. So that if the sheriff came to one house, the slaves could escape underground through this tunnel to a house about 2 blocks away. And there is a legend that in Tabor that was also the case, that a tunnel ran under the commons from Reverend Todd's home to another house on the other side of the town common. That has never really been proved, but there is a legend to that effect. So don't imagine that the Underground Railroad actually went underground. The Underground Railroad was a means of escape which was very useful, but the underground feature merely referred to the secrecy with which the conductors operated. So we can get a picture of a conductor here, a conductor of an underground railroad, by just enlarging upon this a little bit. We'll make a cap out of this, you see. And here's the nose. Here's the determined jaw. of an operator of the Underground Railroad. A man who was determined to help these unfortunate people escape, and who was therefore called a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And he wasn't actually underground. Next week we are going to Mount Vernon, and we'll visit one of the centers of Christian education, one of the early colleges established in the state of Iowa. Until then, goodbye.
God bless.
Sorry that was so long, but I thought it was entertaining. Especially when you see not only the history of the Underground Railroad, but you have the multimedia talent of what it took place to make that program possible in 1956.
What was the name of that program? Was there a name to that? That? Okay.
Produced under Landmarks in Iowa History, and there's a series of them available through the, what was Iowa Teachers College made that, and they presented it through all the schools in those years in Iowa. The last story I have here is just something I found, that this is a woman named Charlotta Piles, and she was a Negro slave who escaped through the Underground Railroad, and she ended up staying in Iowa, and she is buried in Keokuk, down in the southeast corner of the state. This program will be available as well in paper copy. If anybody would so desire to have it, we will make it available at a later date during the reenactment in September. And with that, I close with this.